Introduction to Dynamical Systems, Part 2, Constructing a Dynamical System. As becomes obvious from the title of this part, we are going to discuss how to construct a dynamical system for a certain real device. For this purpose, let us look at a very simple system, a mechanical pendulum. As you know, a mechanical pendulum contains the following components. There is a bob whose mass is m, and this bob is attached to a rod whose length is L. We assume that the other end of this rod is attached to some motionless beam, and the pendulum will fluctuate in the presence of gravity force whose acceleration is denoted as g. In constructing a dynamical model for this device, the first step is to identify the so-called parameters. Parameters are such quantities which we assume constant, unchanged throughout the system behavior. The first obvious parameter is the mass of the bob, which we assume a constant. The second parameter is the length of the rod. And finally, it is acceleration g due to gravity. Please note that in reality, while the pendulum fluctuates, the rod might be slightly elastic and it might slightly fluctuate in its length. But when we identify parameters to write a relatively simple model, we need to use our intuition and to decide what is really important and what is probably not as important to describe the behavior of our system. And in this situation, it is worth ignoring tiny fluctuations of the length of the rod, assuming that L is a constant. Also, we assume that the size of the bob is very small as compared to the length of the rod, so we ignore it. It might also make sense to ignore friction force, which of course is always there, but suppose we do not take it into account in the first approximation. The second stage involves identifying the state variables, which means that we need to identify all quantities which evolve in time, but there should be sufficiently many such quantities so that we could predict the behavior of the system at the next step. So we need to be able to predict what the system is going to do next based on what we know it is doing right now. One obvious variable here is the angle between the rod and the vertical line. Of course, while the pendulum fluctuates, this angle changes in time. However, let us consider, if we know at the given time moment only the value of this angle and nothing else, can we really predict whether the bob is going to go upwards or downwards? Is the angle enough to make such a prediction? And the answer is no, because we need really to know where the system is moving. It means that we need some other state variable. Let us consider the state variable called the rate of change of the angle theta, theta dot. If we know two values at the same time, the angle and how quickly it changes, in fact, we should be able to predict the next move of the bob. For example, if the rate of change, if this velocity of theta is positive, the angle theta increases. If it is negative, the angle theta is going to decrease. And we will also know how quickly this is going to happen. So yes, it seems that in the first approximation, a combination of theta and theta dot should be enough to describe the state of our pendulum. So our state vector is formed. At the third step, we should determine the evolution operator. To do this, we in fact need to specify some rules according to which the individual variables change the velocity of their change if the state changes. So basically we need to specify the rates of change of the state variables as functions of the current state. For the pendulum, it is reasonably easy to do this. We make use of the famous second Newton's law of motion, which says that the mass times acceleration is equal to force. And we can construct the second order ordinary differential equation, which reads as shown on the slide. But this is not enough, because we need to convert this into a proper dynamical system. To do this, let us introduce two state variables. We rename theta as x, and remember that it is the angular position of the pendulum. We also introduce the angular velocity theta dot and denote it as y. And we observe that the second derivative of theta is given to be the first derivative of y. This allows us to rewrite the original second-order ordinary differential equation as a system of two first-order ODEs. We might not be able to solve this system of equations analytically, at least not as easily as for a good, nice linear system. However, we should be able to learn something from the phase portrait of this system, which is shown in the right-hand side of the slide. Blue arrows show the values of the velocity vectors, and you can see that the phase trajectories shown in red roughly follow these velocity vectors. So based on this phase portrait, we can roughly qualitatively predict how the pendulum will behave. That was a simple example of a non-living system. However, we're obviously interested in the possibility to construct a dynamical system for some living systems, biological systems. Living systems are traditionally regarded as being quite different from non-living ones. And this is of course correct, but fortunately we have to remember one thing, that living systems live in the same universe as all other systems, including non-living systems. And that means that living systems do obey all the same laws of physics, chemistry, and all other laws of this universe as any other device. This helps us in constructing appropriate dynamical models for them. Consider some cases. First of all, it is important to appreciate that biological systems are governed by the laws of physics, for example, the laws of electricity. For some biological devices, we know that in their functioning, electricity plays a key role, for example, in neuron cells. In neuron cells, there are electrical charges, there are electrical currents through the cell membrane, and there are voltages across the cell membrane. This means that very often, for a biological device, it is possible to introduce an equivalent circuit combining equivalent electrical resistances, conductances, capacitances, and perhaps some more complex elements, maybe nonlinear elements. And then, to such a circuit, we can apply the famous Kirchhoff laws, which are laws describing the behavior of voltages and currents in electrical circuits, in standard electrical circuits. Then, from these laws, we can derive appropriate differential equations for all the variables involved, for currents, voltages, charges, and etc. Consider an example. Our example is going to be a cardiac pacemaker cell, and the first model for such a cell was introduced in 1962 by Dennis Noble and co-authors. You might have heard that the reason the hearts can beat is thanks to the presence of a certain number of very special cells in the heart called pacemaker cells. These cells force the heart to contract because they generate a certain rhythm, a certain regular rhythm. For such a pacemaker cell, it is possible to construct the equivalent circuit, one simple example of which is shown in the left-hand side of the slide. Because this is just a standard electronic circuit, we can apply Kirchhoff laws and write down a system of ordinary differential equations of the first order describing the voltage V and some other variables involved. These equations might look simple at the first glance, but it is important to appreciate that all the highlighted functions are not constants, but are nonlinear functions of this voltage. So the whole dynamical system appears to be a very nonlinear system. If one solves this system of 4 first-order ODEs numerically, the solution will be periodic and it looks like the one shown to the right. And this solution, the shape of this solution, the time scale, the period, and the amplitude of this solution is remarkably consistent with the behavior of voltages, which can be measured in real biological pacemaker cells. So this model is quite good, quite remarkable. The second thing to point out is that biological systems are also governed by the laws of chemistry, and in particular, inside the cells, chemical reactions occur which must obey the law of mass action. The law of mass action is one of the most fundamental laws in chemistry, and it reads as follows. Suppose we are considering a chemical reaction which involves several chemicals, several reactants, as we call them. The rate of a chemical reaction is said to be proportional to the product of the masses of the reactants involved. This is a very non-trivial statement, by the way, but this is a statement remarkably well supported by experiment. Consider a very particular example of a biochemical Michaelis-Menten reaction occurring in a certain cell. What is this reaction about? In this reaction, 3 substances are involved whose quantities vary throughout their reaction. It is the substrate S, which is being converted into some product P, and at the intermediate stage there will be some complex called ES. And the whole reaction takes place in the presence of a certain enzyme E, which catalyzes this reaction. We suppose that reaction rates are known and they are denoted as constants K1, K2 and K-1. For those of you who have learned a little bit of chemistry, it might be easy to read the diagram of this reaction. Well, this diagram simply illustrates what is happening inside this reaction and what the rates of this reaction are at various stages. If we apply the law of mass action, we can convert this law into the following dynamical system consisting of 3 first-order ordinary differential equations for the 3 substances involved. Now, consider the third case And here we appreciate that quite often living systems appear too complicated to describe them in full by any reasonably realistic models. Suppose we look at the population of some species, and then we consider interaction of two or more such populations. Suppose we look at foxes and rabbits. To describe every single member of the population, for example a fox, by a realistic model is really non-feasible. In fact, it is currently impossible. However, it might be possible to look at what these populations are actually doing, to look at the phenomenon occurring in a population or in several interacting populations, and construct a mathematical model describing not the systems involved, not the species, but only the phenomenon itself. Consider a very simple example, or seemingly easy example. Suppose we are looking at plankton, which lives in a pond. Plankton is a relatively simple cell, but still it is quite challenging to model every single cell realistically. But this is not even required if all we want to know is how the mass, the population of plankton in a certain pond grows or decreases or perhaps fluctuating with time. So we are considering only population dynamics, and so we are not interested in the structure of every plankton cell. The simplest model describing the behavior of the population size p with time is given here. This model assumes that the rate at which plankton is being multiplied, is reproducing, is roughly proportional to the current size of this population. Basically, the more plankton we have now, the faster it will be reproducing. This model might be quite reasonable only if we assume that there are infinite resources which can maintain the growth of plankton. Suppose for a second that this is true, and because this dynamical system is only one-dimensional, it is possible to illustrate its behavior with the following diagram. We plot the rate of change of the population against the population itself, and we observe that for the given model the function is a straight line, shown by solid line in this picture. It starts at 0 here and it grows infinitely. Because the equation is linear, we can solve it very easily, and the solution will demonstrate an exponential growth of this population to infinity, which is obviously not very realistic, because to support an infinitely large population we need infinitely many resources. Now consider a more realistic model. This model is highlighted in green box, and this model assumes that the resources are actually finite and there are enough resources to support a steady population whose size is equal to c. Now the model instantly becomes nonlinear, and if we show the phase line diagram, just like before, we show the right-hand side, the rate of change, as a function of the plankton size p. It is shown by the dashed line. We have a parabola, and incidentally, because this particular equation is only one-dimensional, we can actually solve it analytically. It's a rare case, and the solution predicts the so-called logistic growth. So if we start from a small population, the population will initially increase, but then it will stabilize at a certain constant, which is equal to the optimal population size. I would like to acknowledge professional and technical assistance from Olga Sosnovtseva, Dmitry Pasnov, and the Center for Online and Blended Learning in the University of Copenhagen.